In the shadowed corners of corporate boardrooms and political corridors, where power concentrates like storm clouds before lightning strikes, Marcus Aurelius Chen had learned to read the language that others spoke in whispers and sideways glances. 23 years of navigating Fortune 500 companies had taught him that beneath every handshake lay a calculation, beneath every smile lived a strategy. Today, as he sat across from Victoria Sterling, the newly appointed CEO of Meridian Industries, he recognized the familiar dance beginning once again. Victoria's office occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Chrysler Building replica that housed Meridian's headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city below, where millions of people moved like pieces on an enormous chessboard. The symbolism wasn't lost on Marcus. Everything in this room, from the positioning of chairs to the carefully curated collection of leadership books on the shelf, had been designed to establish dominance before a single word was spoken. "Marcus," Victoria began, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who had mastered the art of making others feel simultaneously welcomed and evaluated. "I've been reviewing your work with our previous leadership, and, I must say, your ability to navigate complex situations is exactly what we need moving forward." The pause before navigate complex situations lasted exactly 2 seconds longer than natural conversation would dictate. Marcus recognized this as the first probe, a gentle test to see how he would respond to euphemistic language about his willingness to engage in corporate manipulation. He had encountered this pattern hundreds of times before, in boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Wall Street, where the dance of manipulation played out with the precision of a ballet and the ruthlessness of gladiatorial combat. Marcus had spent his career studying what he privately called the Machiavellian Codex, the unwritten laws that governed how power truly operated in modern organizations. These weren't the principles taught in business schools or outlined in corporate ethics manuals. These were the shadow rules that determined who rose and who fell, who controlled information and who remained ignorant, who shaped reality and who merely reacted to the shapes others created. The first law of this hidden codex had crystallized in his mind during his third year at Goldman Sachs, when he watched his mentor, David Richardson, orchestrate the downfall of a rival department head through a campaign so subtle that the target never realized he was under attack. David had called it the law of invisible influence, and Marcus had watched it unfold like a masterclass in human psychology. The key, David had explained during one of their private conversations, is understanding that people believe they make rational decisions based on facts and logic. This belief is their greatest vulnerability. When you can control the context in which someone receives information, you control their decision-making process without them ever realizing you're involved. The technique worked by creating what David termed information architecture, carefully structuring when, how, and from whom targets received crucial data. Rather than directly lying or withholding information, practitioners would ensure that positive information about themselves arrived through trusted channels at moments when targets were most receptive, while negative information about competitors came through sources that seemed independent but were actually orchestrated. Marcus had watched David implement this strategy against Jennifer Walsh, the head of the Emerging Markets Division. Jennifer was brilliant, innovative, and posed a significant threat to David's advancement. Rather than attacking her directly, David began an 18-month campaign of perception management. He ensured that Jennifer's successes were quietly attributed to market conditions or team efforts, while her setbacks were subtly highlighted as leadership failures. He accomplished this not through gossip or direct criticism, but by controlling the narrative framework within which her performance was evaluated. The process began with David volunteering to compile quarterly performance reports for the executive committee. This gave him the power to determine which metrics were emphasized, how data was presented, and what contextual information accompanied the raw numbers. Jennifer's impressive gains in emerging markets were presented alongside data showing that all divisions had benefited from favorable currency fluctuations, making her achievements appear less unique. Meanwhile, when her division faced challenges during a regional crisis, the reports emphasized the strategic importance of emerging markets and the need for steady leadership during turbulent times. David simultaneously began what he called cultivation conversations with key executives. These weren't attacks on Jennifer, but rather thoughtful discussions about the future direction of the firm and the leadership qualities that would be necessary for success. He would ask open-ended questions. As we think about expanding our global footprint, what kind of experience and temperament do you think will be most valuable? Or, given the volatility we're seeing in emerging markets, how important is it to have leaders who can maintain stability while pushing for growth? These conversations planted seeds that grew into evaluation criteria that happened to favor David's strengths while highlighting areas where Jennifer had less experience. By the time performance reviews arrived, the executives conducting them had unconsciously internalized a framework that made David appear to be the natural choice for promotion and Jennifer seem like a talented but risky option. The brilliance of the strategy lay in its invisibility. Jennifer never knew she was under attack because there was no attack to perceive. No one had criticized her work, undermined her projects, or spread negative information about her character. Instead, David had slowly shifted the lens through which her performance was viewed, like adjusting the focus on a microscope until the same specimen appears entirely different. Marcus had felt sick watching this unfold, but he had also been fascinated by the psychological precision involved. David had identified the fundamental human tendency to mistake the frame for the picture, to confuse the context in which information is presented with the information itself. Everyone involved believed they were making objective assessments based on factual data, never realizing that their perceptions had been carefully sculpted by an invisible hand. The strategy culminated when Jennifer was passed over for a promotion she had clearly earned. She requested feedback and was told that while her technical skills were excellent, the executive team felt she needed more experience managing through volatile periods before taking on larger responsibilities. She accepted this feedback as legitimate guidance, never suspecting that the concerns about her readiness had been systematically cultivated over 18 months of careful information management. Jennifer left the firm 6 months later, accepting a position at a competitor where she immediately flourished, leading Marcus to realize that David's assessment of her capabilities had been completely wrong. She hadn't lacked the skills for advancement, she had simply been outmaneuvered by someone who understood that success in corporate environments often had little to do with competence and everything to do with perception management. This revelation had led Marcus to articulate what he considered the second law of Machiavellian manipulation: reality is negotiable, but consensus is power. The most successful manipulators didn't impose their version of reality through force or obvious deception. Instead, they created conditions where others would naturally arrive at conclusions that served the manipulator's interests, believing they had reached these conclusions through independent thought. Marcus had seen this principle applied across countless situations throughout his career. In merger negotiations, skilled manipulators would plant concerns about timing, market conditions, or regulatory issues, not through direct statements but through casual mentions of articles they had read, conversations they had overheard, or trends they had noticed. These seeds of doubt would grow in their targets' minds, creating anxiety that made them more willing to accept less favorable terms to avoid perceived risks that might or might not have been real. In team dynamics, masterful manipulators would shape group decisions by controlling the sequence in which options were presented, the language used to describe alternatives, and the implicit assumptions that framed the discussion. They might begin meetings by expressing concern about timeline pressures, causing the team to prioritize quick decisions over thorough analysis, or they might emphasize the importance of consensus, making team members reluctant to voice strong objections to proposals that seemed to have broad support. The technique worked because it exploited fundamental features of human psychology: the tendency to accept information that confirms existing beliefs, the desire to maintain consistency with previous decisions, the influence of social proof on individual judgment, and the power of authoritative sources to shape perception. Skilled practitioners became experts at triggering these psychological mechanisms while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Marcus remembered watching Sarah Goldman, a senior partner at McKinsey, demonstrate this principle during a client presentation about organizational restructuring. The client, a regional bank facing competitive pressure from fintech startups, had asked for recommendations about improving operational efficiency. Sarah's team had identified several potential approaches, ranging from incremental process improvements to fundamental business model changes. Rather than presenting these options neutrally, Sarah structured the presentation to guide the client toward the most extensive and expensive restructuring option. She began by establishing a frame of urgency, showing data about how quickly fintech companies were gaining market share and emphasizing the accelerating pace of industry disruption. She then presented the incremental options first, describing them as traditional approaches that might have been sufficient in a more stable environment but seemed inadequate given the scope of the challenges we're facing. The comprehensive restructuring option was presented last, described as a transformation initiative that would position the bank for sustainable competitive advantage in the digital era. Sarah supported this option with case studies from other companies that had successfully navigated similar transitions and data projecting significant long-term benefits. She never explicitly criticized the smaller interventions, but the sequencing and language created a clear hierarchy in the client's mind. The presentation concluded with what Sarah called a decision framework that weighted factors like strategic impact, competitive positioning, and future readiness more heavily than traditional metrics like implementation cost or short-term disruption. This framework, presented as an objective analytical tool, was actually designed to make the comprehensive restructuring appear to be the only logical choice for any forward-thinking leadership team. Marcus had watched the client executives' faces as they absorbed this information. He could see them convincing themselves that the expensive transformation was not only wise but necessary, that choosing a smaller intervention would represent a failure of vision and courage. They weren't being deceived so much as being guided to deceive themselves, to mistake a carefully constructed narrative for independent analysis. The contract for the comprehensive restructuring was worth $12 million, compared to perhaps $2 million for the incremental approaches. Sarah's team spent the next 18 months implementing changes that disrupted the bank's operations, alienated experienced employees, and ultimately failed to improve competitive positioning. The fintech threat had been real, but the solution had been designed more to benefit McKinsey than to address the client's actual needs. This experience had taught Marcus the third law: the most effective manipulation creates genuine conviction in its targets. When people believe they have arrived at conclusions through careful analysis rather than external influence, they become emotionally invested in defending those conclusions. They will rationalize contradictory evidence, dismiss alternative viewpoints, and even escalate commitment when initial results prove disappointing. As Marcus sat across from Victoria Sterling, he recognized that she was attempting to implement these same principles in their conversation. Her opening comment about his ability to navigate complex situations was designed to establish a shared understanding that ethical flexibility would be both expected and rewarded in their working relationship. The compliment was structured to make him feel valued while simultaneously testing his willingness to accept euphemistic language about questionable practices. Victoria's office setup reinforced this message. The commanding view from the 42nd floor suggested someone who operated from a position of superior perspective, who could see patterns and opportunities that others missed. The leadership books were positioned to be visible but not prominent, creating a subtle impression of intellectual authority without appearing pretentious. Even her choice of clothing, a tailored black suit with subtle but expensive details, communicated power, sophistication, and attention to strategic presentation. Marcus realized that Victoria was implementing what he had come to understand as the fourth law: environment shapes perception more powerfully than argument. The most skilled manipulators understood that physical and social context could influence decision-making at a subconscious level, making targets more receptive to certain types of proposals or more likely to adopt particular roles in an interaction. He had learned this principle through painful experience during his time at Deutsche Bank, where he had watched Thomas Muller, the head of European operations, use environmental manipulation to control high-stakes negotiations. Thomas would vary the location, timing, and setup of important meetings based on the psychological impact he wanted to create. For negotiations where he wanted to establish dominance, Thomas would hold meetings in his corner office, with participants seated in chairs slightly lower than his desk chair, forcing them to look up at him during conversation. He would schedule these meetings for times when participants would be fighting jet lag or hunger, knowing that physical discomfort would make them more eager to reach quick agreements. For negotiations where he wanted to create a sense of partnership and collaboration, Thomas would choose neutral locations, arrange seating in circles rather than across desks, and ensure that refreshments were available. He would schedule these meetings for times when participants were likely to be fresh and focused, allowing for more thorough discussion of complex issues. For negotiations where he wanted to pressure targets into making concessions, Thomas would create time pressure through scheduling constraints, environmental stressors like uncomfortable temperatures or distracting noise, and social pressure through the presence of additional observers who weren't directly involved in the negotiation but whose presence changed the dynamics of the interaction. Marcus had watched Thomas apply this strategy during a merger negotiation with a smaller German bank. The initial meetings were held in comfortable, neutral conference rooms, with careful attention to creating an atmosphere of mutual respect and shared purpose. Thomas presented the merger as an opportunity for both institutions to achieve greater scale and efficiency, emphasizing the complementary nature of their operations and the potential for preserving the acquired bank's culture and leadership team. As negotiations progressed and the smaller bank's leaders became more comfortable with the general concept, Thomas gradually shifted the environmental conditions. Later meetings were held in Deutsche Bank's headquarters, in rooms that emphasized the size and power differential between the organizations. The conference room on the 38th floor had windows overlooking the smaller bank's offices, creating a subtle but unmistakable reminder of their relative positions in the financial hierarchy. Thomas also began introducing time pressure, mentioning other potential acquisition targets and emphasizing the rapidly changing competitive landscape in German banking. He scheduled crucial negotiating sessions for Friday afternoons, knowing that the smaller bank's team would be eager to conclude discussions before the weekend rather than prolonging difficult conversations. The final negotiations took place in what Thomas called his decision room, a windowless conference room with deliberately harsh lighting and minimal comfort features. The temperature was kept slightly too warm, and the chairs were functional but not comfortable for extended sitting. Thomas would arrive precisely on time, having had his assistant ensure that the other team was kept waiting for exactly 12 minutes, long enough to create anxiety but not so long as to seem deliberately insulting. In this environment, facing time pressure and physical discomfort, the smaller bank's negotiating team accepted terms that were significantly less favorable than what they had originally expected. They agreed to a purchase price 15% below their initial asking price, accepted retention guarantees for only 60% of their staff, and agreed to integrate their operations under Deutsche Bank's systems within 18 months rather than the 3-year timeline they had wanted. Marcus realized that the smaller bank's team never understood how their decision-making had been influenced by environmental factors. They believed they had made rational choices based on market realities and the strength of Deutsche Bank's negotiating position. They didn't recognize that their judgment had been systematically compromised by carefully orchestrated psychological pressure. This experience had led Marcus to understand the fifth law: pressure creates urgency, urgency creates mistakes, and mistakes create opportunities. The most effective manipulators didn't rely on superior arguments or better information. They created conditions where targets would make decisions quickly, under stress, without adequate time for reflection or consultation with advisors who might offer different perspectives. The banking merger had proceeded according to Thomas's timeline, but the integration had been a disaster. The rushed timeline had prevented adequate due diligence, leading to the discovery of significant operational issues that hadn't been identified during negotiations. The retained staff, feeling betrayed by promises that weren't kept, either left voluntarily or became actively disengaged. The cultural integration, which had been presented as a priority during negotiations, was abandoned in favor of faster operational consolidation. Within 2 years, Deutsche Bank had written off most of the acquisition value and was facing regulatory scrutiny over its integration practices. Thomas had achieved his short-term objective of completing the acquisition on favorable terms, but the long-term results had been damaging for both organizations. The smaller bank's leadership team, which had believed they were entering a partnership that would preserve their institution's character while providing greater resources, found themselves managing the liquidation of everything they had built. This outcome had reinforced Marcus's growing understanding that Machiavellian tactics, while often effective in achieving immediate goals, frequently created long-term costs that exceeded short-term benefits. The psychological techniques that made manipulation possible also made sustainable relationships impossible, because they were fundamentally based on deception and exploitation rather than mutual value creation. As his career progressed, Marcus had begun developing what he thought of as counter-manipulation strategies, techniques for recognizing and neutralizing manipulative tactics while protecting his own decision-making from external influence. He had started by learning to identify the emotional and psychological states that made him most vulnerable to manipulation: when he was under time pressure, when he was seeking approval from authority figures, when he was feeling uncertain about his competence, and when he was operating outside his areas of expertise. He had developed personal protocols for high-stakes decisions, automatically extending timelines when possible, seeking input from advisors who had no stake in the outcome, independently researching claims made by interested parties, and creating decision criteria before entering negotiations rather than allowing others to define the framework for evaluation. Most importantly, Marcus had learned to recognize the language patterns and behavioral cues that indicated when someone was attempting to manipulate his perceptions. Excessive flattery, artificial urgency, attempts to isolate him from advisors, requests for commitment before providing complete information, and efforts to frame decisions in terms of his identity or values rather than objective costs and benefits had all become red flags that triggered additional scrutiny. Now, sitting across from Victoria Sterling, Marcus could see multiple manipulation techniques being deployed simultaneously. The environment had been carefully designed to establish her authority and his subordinate position. Her opening comments were structured to test his willingness to engage in ethically questionable behavior while making him feel valued and special. The meeting had been scheduled during his lunch hour, creating subtle time pressure that might make him more likely to agree to requests without lengthy consideration. Marcus recognized that this conversation represented a decision point that would shape not only his immediate future at Meridian Industries but also his long-term relationship with the principles he had developed through years of observing and experiencing organizational manipulation. He could play along with Victoria's implicit invitation to become complicit in whatever scheme she was planning, or he could begin implementing the defensive strategies he had spent years developing. Part 2, the counter-strike protocols. The choice Marcus faced in Victoria's office was one he had been preparing for throughout his career without realizing it. Every manipulation he had witnessed, every corporate power play he had observed, every example of psychological pressure he had experienced had been building toward this moment when he would need to decide whether to become a practitioner of the dark arts he had studied or to forge a different path entirely. Victoria continued her careful probe, leaning forward slightly as she spoke. I've been thinking about our expansion into the Southeast Asian markets, and I believe your experience with flexible regulatory environments could be invaluable. We need someone who understands that different markets require different approaches to relationship building and influence management. The language was carefully chosen. Flexible regulatory environments was code for markets where corruption was common and expected. Different approaches to relationship building meant bribery, and influence management referred to the kind of systematic manipulation that had characterized Marcus's observations of corporate behavior for 2 decades. Marcus felt a familiar tension between his intellectual fascination with manipulative techniques and his growing moral discomfort with their application. He had spent years studying these methods like a scholar examining ancient warfare tactics, interested in their sophistication and effectiveness while being horrified by their human cost. Now Victoria was inviting him to move from observer to participant, from student to practitioner. He realized that this moment represented the perfect opportunity to implement what he had begun thinking of as the 6th law: the best defense against manipulation is transparency about manipulation. Rather than playing along with Victoria's careful dance or directly rejecting her overtures, Marcus decided to make the subtext explicit, forcing the conversation into territory where manipulative techniques would be more difficult to deploy. Victoria, Marcus said, maintaining steady eye contact and speaking in a deliberately neutral tone, I appreciate your confidence in my abilities, but I want to make sure we're having a clear conversation about expectations. When you mention flexible regulatory environments and different approaches to relationship building, are you referring to practices that would violate U.S. foreign corruption laws or Meridian's stated ethical policies? The question created what Marcus thought of as conversational transparency, explicitly acknowledging the underlying agenda that both parties understood but hadn't directly discussed. This technique worked by removing the plausible deniability that made subtle manipulation possible. Once the true nature of a conversation had been explicitly acknowledged, participants could no longer pretend they were engaged in innocent discussion about general business strategies. Victoria's reaction confirmed Marcus's assessment of her intentions. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression of surprise and calculation that lasted perhaps half a second before being replaced by a practiced smile. She had been caught between her desire to secure Marcus's cooperation and her need to maintain legal distance from anything that could be construed as direct instruction to engage in illegal activities. Marcus, she said after a carefully timed pause, I think you might be misunderstanding the scope of what we're discussing. International business requires building relationships with local partners and understanding cultural norms around decision-making processes. I'm simply noting that your experience in emerging markets has given you insights into how business relationships develop in different cultural contexts. Marcus recognized this response as a classic example of what he called strategic retreat with reframe, backing away from explicit discussion of questionable practices while attempting to establish a new conversational framework that would allow for continued manipulation through implication rather than direct statement. Victoria's response also demonstrated the seventh law that Marcus had observed throughout his career: successful manipulation requires maintaining plausible deniability about manipulative intent. The most skilled practitioners always ensured they could retreat to innocent interpretations of their words and actions when challenged directly. Marcus decided to implement what he had come to think of as the documentation protocol, a defensive technique that involved creating explicit records of conversations where manipulation was being attempted. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a legal pad, placing it on the table between them. "I appreciate the clarification," Marcus said, picking up his pen. "Given the potential sensitivity of international business development, I'd like to take some notes about our conversation to ensure I understand your expectations correctly. Could you help me understand specifically what cultural norms and relationship-building practices you think would be most important for me to employ in Southeast Asian markets?" The introduction of note-taking changed the dynamics of the conversation immediately. Victoria's body language shifted, becoming more formal and guarded. She understood that anything she said would now potentially become part of a written record that could be referenced in future conversations or, in worst-case scenarios, legal proceedings. Marcus had learned this technique from observing how federal investigators conducted interviews with corporate executives. The mere presence of documentation dramatically reduced the likelihood that targets would make incriminating statements, not because they were necessarily planning to use the records against targets, but because the awareness of being recorded forced more careful consideration of language and implications. "Of course," Victoria said, her tone becoming noticeably more cautious. "I think the most important thing to understand is that business relationships in many Asian cultures are built over longer time periods and involve more personal connection than typical American business practices. Success often depends on demonstrating long-term commitment to regional partners and understanding their perspectives on mutually beneficial collaboration." The language had become completely sanitized, stripped of the euphemisms and implications that had characterized her earlier comments. Marcus realized that Victoria was now operating in what he thought of as defensive compliance mode, ensuring that anything she said could be safely repeated in any business context without suggesting impropriety. This transformation illustrated the eighth law that Marcus had identified: manipulation thrives in ambiguity and withers under scrutiny. The techniques that worked in private conversations with implicit understandings became impossible to deploy when the conversation was being documented and when participants were forced to speak explicitly about their intentions and expectations. Marcus continued taking notes while asking follow-up questions designed to maintain transparency and prevent the conversation from drifting back into manipulative territory. "That's helpful context. When you mention demonstrating long-term commitment to regional partners, are you referring to specific business practices that Meridian should consider adopting, or general relationship management principles that would guide my approach to partner development?" Victoria spent the next 20 minutes providing the kind of generic advice about international business that could have been found in any cross-cultural management textbook. She discussed the importance of understanding hierarchical structures in Asian business culture, the role of personal relationships in business decision-making, and the need for patience in developing trust with potential partners. Marcus continued taking detailed notes, asking for clarification when Victoria's comments were vague and requesting specific examples when she made general statements. This process gradually transformed their interaction from a manipulation attempt into a genuine business planning conversation. As the meeting concluded, Marcus realized that he had successfully implemented what he was beginning to think of as the transparency defense, neutralizing manipulative tactics by making them impossible to deploy while still maintaining professional relationships and achieving legitimate business objectives. The experience had also clarified his understanding of the ninth law: countermanipulation requires shifting conversational frameworks from implicit to explicit. Most manipulation techniques relied on shared understanding that certain things could be discussed indirectly but never stated directly. By consistently pushing conversations toward explicit discussion of intentions and expectations, it became possible to maintain ethical boundaries while still engaging productively with people who might prefer to operate in more ambiguous territory. Over the following weeks, Marcus began implementing this approach across his interactions at Meridian Industries. When colleagues made vague references to creative solutions for regulatory challenges, he would ask for specific examples of what they had in mind. When superiors made comments about the need for flexible thinking about ethical guidelines, he would request written clarification of company policies and expectations. This approach had an interesting side effect. it actually improved his professional relationships with most colleagues. People who were operating in good faith appreciated the clarity and directness, while those who had been attempting manipulation either adjusted their behavior or began avoiding interactions with Marcus entirely. The strategy also provided protection against what Marcus recognized as the 10th law: organizations often tolerate manipulation until forced to confront it directly. Companies typically avoided acknowledging manipulative behavior among their employees as long as it remained subtle and didn't create obvious legal or reputational risks. However, when manipulative tactics were made explicit and documented, organizations were forced to either endorse or discourage the behavior. Marcus's approach of creating transparency effectively forced Meridian's leadership to clarify their actual expectations rather than relying on winks and nods to communicate acceptance of questionable practices. This process revealed that while certain individuals within the organization were willing to engage in manipulation and corner-cutting, the company's formal policies and most senior leadership were genuinely committed to ethical business practices. The revelation led Marcus to articulate the 11th law: manipulation often thrives in the gap between official policy and unofficial culture. Many organizations created conditions where unethical behavior flourished not because leadership explicitly endorsed such behavior, but because they failed to create systems that made ethical behavior as easy and rewarding as unethical alternatives. Marcus had observed this dynamic repeatedly throughout his career. Companies would establish comprehensive ethics policies and provide training on appropriate business conduct, but then create performance incentives that were difficult to achieve without cutting ethical corners. They would publicly commit to fair dealing with competitors while privately rewarding employees who found ways to undermine rivals through questionable means. The disconnect between stated values and actual incentives created what Marcus thought of as ethical arbitrage opportunities, situations where employees could advance their careers by engaging in behavior that violated the spirit of company policies while remaining technically compliant with the letter of those policies. Marcus decided to address this dynamic directly by proposing what he called an ethical alignment audit for Meridian's international expansion plans. He suggested a systematic review of how the company's performance measurement and incentive systems interacted with its ethical guidelines, particularly in emerging markets where regulatory oversight might be less rigorous. The proposal served multiple purposes. On the surface, it was a legitimate business initiative designed to reduce legal and reputational risks associated with international expansion. At a deeper level, it was a strategic move to force organizational clarity about ethical expectations and to create systems that would make manipulation more difficult to practice and easier to detect. Victoria initially resisted the proposal, arguing that it would slow down their expansion timeline and create unnecessary bureaucratic overhead. However, when Marcus presented the idea to Meridian's board of directors as a risk management initiative, they enthusiastically endorsed it, recognizing the potential legal and reputational benefits of proactive ethics management. The resistance pattern revealed something important about Victoria's true priorities and methods. Someone who was genuinely committed to ethical business practices would have welcomed systems designed to ensure compliance with company values. The fact that Victoria saw such systems as obstacles suggested that she had indeed been planning to operate in the gray areas that Marcus's transparency approach was designed to illuminate. As the ethical alignment audit moved forward, Marcus discovered extensive evidence of what he came to understand as the 12th law: manipulation creates systemic vulnerabilities that extend far beyond individual relationships. Organizations that tolerated manipulative behavior in certain contexts found that such behavior gradually spread throughout their culture, creating networks of complicity that became increasingly difficult to change or control. The audit revealed that Meridian's Southeast Asian expansion plans had been developed through a series of informal conversations and cultural consultation meetings that had never been properly documented. Key decisions about partner selection, market entry strategies, and relationship management approaches had been made based on recommendations from consultants and advisors whose credentials and potential conflicts of interest had never been thoroughly vetted. Marcus realized that Victoria had been building what he thought of as a manipulation infrastructure, a network of relationships and communication channels that would allow questionable practices to be implemented without clear accountability or oversight. The ethical alignment audit was systematically dismantling this infrastructure by requiring documentation, transparency, and formal approval processes for activities that had previously been handled through informal arrangements. The process also revealed the 13th law: counter-manipulation requires institutional change, not just individual resistance. While Marcus's personal strategy of enforcing conversational transparency had been effective in protecting him from direct manipulation, addressing the broader problem required changing organizational systems and cultures in ways that made manipulation more difficult and less rewarding for everyone involved. This realization led Marcus to develop what he began thinking of as the Institutional Transparency Protocol, a comprehensive approach to organizational change that would create systematic barriers to manipulation while preserving the flexibility and efficiency that legitimate business operations required. Part 3, The New Equilibrium. The Institutional Transparency Protocol that Marcus developed over the following months represented a fundamental reimagining of how organizations could protect themselves against manipulation while maintaining the trust and flexibility necessary for effective business operations. Rather than simply defending against manipulative tactics, the approach sought to create organizational structures that made manipulation unnecessary and unrewarding. The first component of the protocol involved what Marcus called decision architecture reform. He had observed that manipulation thrived in organizational environments where important decisions were made through informal processes with limited documentation and unclear accountability. By systematically restructuring how Meridian made decisions about partnerships, market entry strategies, and relationship management, Marcus sought to create natural barriers to manipulative influence. The new decision-making framework required that all significant business development initiatives follow a structured process that included explicit stakeholder identification, documented criteria for evaluation, multiple perspectives on key decisions, and clear timelines that prevented artificial urgency from driving poor choices. Most importantly, the process included what Marcus called devil's advocate requirements, formal roles for individuals to present alternative viewpoints and challenge prevailing assumptions. This approach directly addressed several of the manipulation techniques that Marcus had observed throughout his career. The stakeholder identification process made it difficult for manipulators to control information flow by ensuring that multiple parties had access to relevant data. The documented evaluation criteria prevented post hoc rationalization and made it easier to identify when decisions were being driven by factors other than legitimate business considerations. The devil's advocate requirements were particularly effective at neutralizing manipulation because they institutionalized skepticism and alternative thinking. Rather than relying on individual courage to challenge questionable proposals, the new system made such challenges a formal responsibility and protected those who fulfilled this role from retaliation. Marcus tested this approach during Meridian's evaluation of a proposed partnership with Pacific Rim Industries, a Singapore-based conglomerate that Victoria had identified as a potential gateway to Southeast Asian markets. Under the previous informal system, such partnerships would have been evaluated through a series of meetings between Victoria and selected advisors, with limited documentation and minimal input from legal, compliance, or operational teams. The new process required a cross-functional evaluation team that included representatives from business development, legal, compliance, finance, and operations. Each team member was required to evaluate the partnership against predetermined criteria and to document their analysis in writing. 2 team members were specifically assigned to present arguments against the partnership, regardless of their personal opinions about its merits. The structured evaluation revealed several concerning aspects of the Pacific Rim Industries relationship that would likely have been overlooked or minimized under the previous system. The company's ownership structure included several entities based in jurisdictions known for financial secrecy, making it difficult to verify ultimate beneficial ownership. Their business development approach in previous partnerships had involved extensive entertainment and gift-giving that might violate foreign corruption laws depending on how it was structured and documented. Most significantly, the financial projections supporting the partnership were based on assumptions about regulatory approval timelines and market access that Pacific Rim's representatives had indicated they could facilitate through their local relationships. When pressed for specifics about how this facilitation would work, Pacific Rim's team had provided vague assurances about their deep understanding of local business culture and their established relationships with key decision-makers. Under Victoria's preferred approach, these concerns would likely have been dismissed as excessive caution or cultural misunderstanding. The structured evaluation process, however, required that each concern be explicitly addressed with documented evidence before the partnership could proceed. The devil's advocate presentations were particularly revealing. The team members assigned to argue against the partnership presented a compelling case that Pacific Rim Industries was essentially offering to serve as an intermediary for activities that Meridian could not legally or ethically engage in directly. The facilitation services they offered appeared to be precisely the kind of influence arrangements that had created legal and reputational problems for other American companies operating in Southeast Asian markets. When confronted with this analysis, Victoria attempted to implement several of the manipulation techniques that Marcus had learned to recognize. She emphasized the urgent competitive pressures facing Meridian in Southeast Asian markets, suggesting that excessive caution would result in missed opportunities that competitors would certainly exploit. She questioned whether the evaluation team truly understood the cultural context of business relationships in the region, implying that their concerns reflected a naive and ethnocentric perspective on international business practices. Most tellingly, Victoria attempted to reframe the discussion in terms of personal and organizational identity. She suggested that rejecting the Pacific Rim Partnership would signal that Meridian was not serious about international expansion and lacked the sophistication necessary for success in global markets. She characterized the legal and compliance concerns as the kind of bureaucratic overcaution that prevented American companies from competing effectively against more pragmatic international rivals. The manipulation attempt failed because the institutional framework Marcus had created made it impossible for Victoria to control the information environment or pressure individual decision-makers in isolation. The documented evaluation criteria meant that concerns about legal compliance and ethical issues had already been established as legitimate factors in partnership decisions. The cross-functional team structure meant that no single person could be pressured to override collective judgment. The devil's advocate requirements legitimized skepticism and made it professionally rewarding rather than risky to voice concerns about questionable practices. After extensive discussion and additional due diligence, Meridian's leadership decided to decline the Pacific Rim Partnership and instead pursue relationships with partners whose business practices were more clearly aligned with American legal and ethical standards. This decision was made not because the leadership team was unwilling to take risks or pursue international opportunities, but because the structured evaluation process had revealed that the specific risks associated with Pacific Rim Industries were poorly understood and potentially severe. The outcome validated Marcus's understanding of the 14th law: systematic transparency creates better decisions, not just more ethical ones. The institutional changes he had implemented had not prevented Meridian from pursuing international expansion, they had helped the company avoid a partnership that could have created significant long-term problems while providing limited sustainable value. The Pacific Rim evaluation also revealed the operation of the 15th law. Manipulative relationships are ultimately unsustainable because they are based on misaligned incentives. The partnership Victoria had proposed would have required Meridian to depend on Pacific Rim's willingness to engage in practices that created legal and reputational risks for Meridian while providing Pacific Rim with leverage over Meridian's business operations. Such relationships inevitably became extractive over time, with the party willing to take greater risks gaining increasing power over the party that needed to maintain clean legal and reputational standing. Marcus had observed this dynamic repeatedly in his career, watching companies become trapped in relationships with facilitators who gradually increased their demands and reduced their services as their clients became more dependent on their services. 6 months after implementing the Institutional Transparency Protocol, Marcus had the opportunity to evaluate its broader effects on Meridian's organizational culture and business performance. The results exceeded his expectations in several important ways. First, the company's decision-making process had become both more rigorous and more efficient. While the structured evaluation requirements initially created additional work, they ultimately reduced the time spent on projects that were based on poor assumptions or inadequate analysis. Several potential partnerships and market entry strategies had been modified or abandoned during the evaluation process, saving resources that would have been wasted on initiatives with fundamental flaws. Second, the transparency requirements had improved relationships between different departments within Meridian. Legal and compliance teams, which had previously been excluded from business development discussions until problems arose, were now involved in planning processes from the beginning. This early involvement prevented many issues that would have required expensive remediation later and created opportunities for creative solutions that satisfied both business objectives and regulatory requirements. Third, the institutional changes had attracted high-quality business partners who valued Meridian's commitment to transparent and ethical business practices. several companies had specifically mentioned Meridian's structured evaluation process as a factor in their willingness to enter partnerships, recognizing that such processes provided better protection for all parties involved. Most importantly, the changes had neutralized the influence of individuals within Meridian who had been using manipulation techniques to advance personal agendas that were not aligned with the company's long-term interests. Victoria Sterling had initially attempted to work within the new system, but, when her proposals consistently failed to meet the documented evaluation criteria, she had gradually disengaged from international expansion planning. Victoria's withdrawal from these activities had revealed the extent to which her previous influence had been based on her ability to control information and pressure decision-makers rather than on her actual expertise in international business development. When forced to compete based on the quality of her analysis and the sustainability of her proposals, her contributions had proven to be far less valuable than her organizational positioning had suggested. 8 months after the Institutional Transparency Protocol was fully implemented, Victoria left Meridian Industries to accept a position with a smaller consulting firm that specialized in emerging market entry strategies. Her departure was handled professionally, and she continued to speak positively about Meridian in industry contexts. However, Marcus learned through informal channels that her new position involved helping clients navigate complex regulatory environments and cultural relationship management, euphemisms that suggested she had found an organizational context where her preferred approach to business development was considered appropriate. Victoria's departure led Marcus to articulate the 16th law: institutional resistance to manipulation naturally selects for people who prefer transparency and collaboration. Organizations that systematically implemented barriers to manipulative behavior did not simply change how existing employees acted, they also influenced who wanted to work for the organization and who found the culture compatible with their preferred methods of operation. The broader implications of this selection effect were significant. As Meridian continued to operate under the Transparency Protocol, the company attracted employees and partners who valued clarity, documentation, and collaborative decision-making. This created a reinforcing cycle where ethical business practices became easier to maintain because they were supported by organizational culture rather than imposed through rules and oversight. Marcus realized that this cultural evolution represented the ultimate achievement of counter-manipulation strategy, creating an environment where manipulation was not just more difficult to practice but actually unnecessary for achieving professional success. When organizational systems rewarded transparency, collaboration, and sustainable relationship building, individual employees had strong incentives to develop these capabilities rather than relying on manipulative techniques. The transformation also revealed the 17th law: the most powerful defense against manipulation is creating alternative pathways to success. Rather than simply punishing manipulative behavior, effective counter-manipulation required providing people with better ways to achieve their legitimate objectives. As Marcus reflected on his career and the changes he had helped implement at Meridian Industries, he understood that his journey from observer to analyst to reformer of manipulative practices had taught him something fundamental about human nature and organizational behavior. Manipulation thrived not because people were inherently unethical, but because organizations often failed to create systems that made ethical behavior as easy, rewarding, and effective as unethical alternatives. The laws that end manipulation forever were not rules for defeating manipulators or exposing their techniques. They were principles for building human systems that naturally discouraged manipulation by making it unnecessary. When people could achieve recognition, advancement, and success through transparency, collaboration, and sustainable relationship building, they had little reason to develop or employ manipulative techniques. Marcus's final law, the 18th law, emerged from this understanding: the end of manipulation begins with the creation of better alternatives. Lasting change required not just resistance to harmful practices but positive vision of more effective approaches to human cooperation and organizational success. 3 years after beginning his counter-manipulation project, Marcus had been promoted to Chief Strategy Officer at Meridian Industries, a role that gave him responsibility for institutional design across the company's global operations. He used this position to extend the transparency protocols to all aspects of Meridian's business, creating what he believed might serve as a model for other organizations seeking to build cultures resistant to manipulation while maintaining the flexibility and innovation necessary for competitive success. The work was far from complete. Marcus understood that manipulation would always remain a temptation for individuals facing pressure, uncertainty, or competition. However, he had proven that organizations could create structural and cultural barriers that made manipulation both more difficult to practice and less necessary for achieving legitimate objectives. The true measure of success would be whether Meridian's approach could be adapted by other organizations and whether the principles Marcus had discovered could contribute to broader changes in how business relationships were structured and managed. The laws that end manipulation forever were ultimately not just techniques for organizational reform but possibilities for reimagining how humans could work together more effectively and ethically in complex institutional environments. As Marcus looked out the window of his new office on the 45th floor of Meridian's headquarters, he realized that the view from positions of organizational power looked different when that power had been achieved through transparency rather than manipulation. Instead of seeing a landscape of competitors to be defeated and obstacles to be overcome, he saw a network of potential collaborators and an ecosystem of relationships that could be developed through honest communication and mutual value creation. The transformation from manipulation to collaboration had not made business easier or less competitive. If anything, the transparency requirements and institutional safeguards created additional work and complexity. However, the relationships and decisions that emerged from this more demanding process proved to be more sustainable, more creative, and ultimately more successful than those built on the shifting foundations of deception and psychological pressure. Marcus had learned that ending manipulation forever was not about eliminating human psychology or removing the competitive dynamics that made business challenging and exciting. It was about channeling human energy and ambition toward approaches that created lasting value rather than temporary advantage, sustainable relationships rather than extractive transactions, and organizational cultures that brought out the best in human capabilities rather than exploiting their weaknesses. The laws that end manipulation forever represented both an analysis of how manipulation operated in organizational contexts and a practical guide for building institutional alternatives. They were lessons learned through careful observation, painful experience, and systematic experimentation with better approaches to human cooperation and conflict. Most importantly, they were principles that could be applied by anyone willing to prioritize long-term relationship building over short-term advantage, systematic thinking over tactical maneuvering, and transparent communication over strategic ambiguity. The choice between manipulation and collaboration was ultimately a choice between different visions of human potential and different approaches to building the organizations and relationships that would shape the future of work and society. The laws represented not just the end of manipulation, but the beginning of more honest, more effective, and more sustainable approaches to achieving individual and organizational success in an interconnected world that increasingly rewarded transparency, collaboration, and authentic value creation over the manipulation techniques that had characterized earlier eras of business and political competition. In the end, Marcus understood that the most powerful law governing human manipulation was also the most hopeful. People generally preferred honest relationships and transparent institutions when such alternatives were available, functional, and rewarding. Creating those alternatives was the work that would truly end manipulation forever.